Hello and welcome to the Deviants Tour Ann Arbor edition. It is my honor to be here this evening with the one and only Sarah Schulman and some wonderful co-hosts. But before we begin and get into official introductions, I would be remiss not to acknowledge the pain that our nation is feeling amidst the loss of Black lives at the hands of our nation's law enforcement. To any Black folks who may be watching, your lives matter. To my predominantly white fans, we must do better. I have posted a link in our Crowdcast description for those who are looking to make a difference for our friends who identify as QTPOC. In the meantime, please join me in a moment of silence to honor the lives of Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others. Thank you. And now I am excited to introduce Joe Shosh. Am I saying it correctly?
Shock, close.
Shock. Oh, well, Joe Shock from Arbor Pride. I was like, I think I know it. Who can talk a little bit about some of the great work they do and some of their programming this Pride Month.
Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate it. Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Shock. I am the director of Arbor Pride, and I also sit on the board of the Gym Toy Community Center in Ann Arbor. We are so thrilled to be co-sponsoring this with Literati, and we're looking forward to continuing to serve our community during this really difficult time. For those of you who are familiar with Arbor Pride, it is in August and will stay in August. And we are moving to a virtual platform. What you can expect is the same kind of fun community and camaraderie that we have in our physical environment. So we will still have our main stage with a wide variety of entertainers, drag, poetry, burlesque, all sorts of fun stuff, yoga as well. We'll also have our kids zone back with our famous drag queen story time, some arts and crafts, and some messages of love and care. And of course, we couldn't do it without our wonderful sponsors. So we look forward to connecting with you all on August 1st. And for more information, please feel free to visit AnnArborPride.com.
Thank you so much. And now from Literati, as you know, everyone, all of these events are in support of independent bookstores. So we're so thrilled to be partnering with y'all. So John, please talk to us about Literati.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. Hi, everybody. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're really pleased to bring this event to you tonight. These virtual events are really a kind of an immense silver lining in a really weird time for our community because having an event with Sarah Schulman and Eric Cervini, I don't know if it would have been able to happen with travel schedules and everything else. So we're really pleased to be able to provide these opportunities while we're all staying safe. We're super thrilled to be partnering with our neighbors at Arbor Pride. And you can buy the book with the buy button. There's a buy button right down there. It'll send you right to our bookstore's website. You can purchase The Deviant's War. While you're there, you can also purchase some other books. Select titles are now available for curbside pickup if you are tuning in from Ann Arbor. I'll also be coming back on at the end of the event to moderate Q&A. You can feel free to ask questions to both Eric and Sarah. The chat function is disabled, but there's a Q&A function down here. You can write your questions in there. And I'll be coming up to say hello. So yeah, please feel free to purchase books. Please do buy Eric's book at literatibookstore.com. And we also suggest if you'd like to sustain our ongoing fundraising that makes these events possible, you can also do that at literatibookstore.com. There's a donate button, but we just thank you for being in attendance and supporting these authors and supporting the Ann Arbor community. So without further ado, I'll do what I normally do, where I'm standing at the lectern at Literati and introduce our guest tonight. Eric Cervini is an award-winning historian of LGBTQ+ culture and politics. He graduated summa cum laude from Harvard College and received his PhD in history from the University of Cambridge, where he was a Gates Scholar. The Deviant's War is his first book. And Sarah Schulman is a novelist, playwright, screenwriter, nonfiction writer, and AIDS historian. Her 20th book, Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP, will be published by Farrar, Straus & Grow in May of 2021. Please welcome them both to your screens.
Great,
Thank you so much.
This is a great time. This is a great time to talk about how movements get born and how they progress. And I have a lot of questions for you, but I just want to ask you a personal question first. What made you decide to do gay history and why gay movement history?
Ooh, it's a good question. Well, I didn't start my academic career wanting to be a historian. I started undergrad thinking I was going to go to law school and maybe get involved in politics or something. And it wasn't until I watched the film Milk, as I think I must have been 18 or 19, that I realized, A, how did I not know this story earlier, right? How did I not learn about Harvey Milk and this very important figure as a high school student who was very interested in American history? I'd taken several classes on it. And even in my first years at Harvard, had no idea of his name. And so then that realization that, well, how did I not know his name? Then the next step was, well, what other names do I not know? And as you know, so much of writing history is excavating what sort of knowledge has not yet been introduced to the academia or to the public yet. And so I soon stumbled upon the name of Frank Kameny, who historians know. Everyone within, the queer history part of academia knows his name, but the general public does not. And even though there was an acknowledgement that he was the grandfather of the gay rights movement, there hadn't really been an in-depth study of his path, especially in the 1960s, and especially not in the immediate aftermath of Stonewall. So that's what I've been working on really for the past 7 years, is realizing actually, yes, his story is very important, but how do we tell his story in the context of the 1960s? And you realize very quickly, it's not just one man's story. This is a national story about the Black freedom movement, about women's liberation, about trans resistance. And so that's why it took a very long time to write the book. But that's how I first got interested in it, because so much of it has yet to been told.
Okay, well, let's start with that, the context. So we know in the early 20th, first part of the 20th century, there's a lot of radical activity. The Communist Party, the Socialist Party gets 900,000 votes for Eugene Debs.
Mm-hmm.
We have the anti-lynching movement, Scottsboro, women's suffrage, and sexology in Europe. But then there's World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And, World War II has been theorized as this time of personal expansion. Alan Berube, we see that for women, for Black people, and for gay people, there's a kind of independence experience that takes place. And then we emerge into the 50s. Now, can you set the stage nationally for politically across the board what was going on in that period in terms of rebellion and resistance?
Well, two sides to that story. First, you have to tell, as you said, of, post-World War II America was a scary time because, starting in 49 and 50, you have this new threat within of the communist menace, right? The Red Scare. And even though that was a political tool, and there have been some great works, David Johnson did his phenomenal work showing how tying homosexuality to the Red Scare, right, the Lavender Scare, was a very convenient political tool, especially for Republicans in 1950, who were faced with the realities of McCarthy's numbers of these security risks within the government were not very reliable. They were very dubious, non-existent numbers to begin with. But once you start saying that homosexuals or sexual deviants are equally dangerous to national security, then you start to see, oh, this actually, it's much easier to find people who are arrested for homosexual activity in public restrooms or in gay bars. That's much easier to prove than someone's ideology. So what started as a very convenient political tool for delegitimizing the Truman administration grew into this really, especially after Eisenhower came into power, a much more routinized apparatus of surveillance and persecution. And you mentioned resistance. That is what provoked some of the very first iterations of gay pride, whether it was Harry Hay on the West Coast here in Los Angeles, or more prominent in my book is Frank Kameny, because they were the victim of these gay purges or the Lavender Scare. And because they were faced with this rationale of the government telling them that they were inherently immoral and inherently secretive and inherently subject to blackmail and a security risk, he, as an astrophysicist who was working for the Defense Department, said that A, that's illogical, and B, I'm going to prove that's illogical by making my own arbitrary argument, which is that to be gay is not inherently immoral, it's inherently morally good. And so that's what I argue is one of the very first iterations of what we now celebrate each and every June.
Well, this dynamic of repression and resistance, we know that individuals and systems act on and transform each other, right? Mm-hmm. And so there are these expressions of resistance in the 50s. I mean, the Montgomery bus boycott is 1955. There's enormous counterculture going on, abstract painting, right? So where does Frank Kameny fit in that sphere of influence?
Absolutely. Well, I think you cannot tell his story without also telling the story of the 60s, and specifically without telling the story of the Black Freedom Movement. And I'm so glad you brought up Montgomery, because I think so many people look at especially queer history and especially, queer activism in a vacuum, which is unfortunate, because if you're only looking at these individuals and these trends within a isolated minority group that was overwhelmingly white, then you're missing a large part of the story, which is how and when and why they were drawing and borrowing from these other movements. So, one thing that a lot of people, especially younger generations, don't know about Montgomery, for example, is that Rosa Parks was not just a victim of persecution. She was consciously chosen by the organizers, including King, because of her status as a very morally sound figure within the community. They actually rejected another potential victim because I believe she had been, she was pregnant. And
child out of marriage.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, we need to give them the credit of saying, well, the Black Freedom Movement recognized the power of respectability, of reclaiming morality for themselves. And that is something that Frank Kameny did just a few years later, the year after Greensboro, after the sit-ins, when on a very visual level, you see, the students dressed very, very properly, sitting very peacefully at the counters at Woolworths, while it's the white racists who are very, very just unequivocally morally corrupt, pouring ketchup and Pepsi on these students. And there's no way to argue with that, especially I think it is in a way performance art, because you are quite literally provoking an image that can then be transmitted across the world. And I think that's something that Kameny saw. And when he was deciding how to react to these claims by the government that he was immoral, he said, well, I'm going to prove that doesn't make any sense. That's completely arbitrary.
So you think his emphasis on masculine clothes for the men and having lesbians wear dresses was influenced somewhat by the Black movement?
Oh, absolutely. There have been great studies done on Black activism, especially in the South, where organizers would tell those who were marching, whether it was the children or people at the churches congregating before a march, dress as if you are going to church, verbatim. That is what they were told. And it was a very, very conscious strategy of, we don't want to look like the anti-war folks, right? We don't want to be, and then you have the same conversations within the homophile movement or the pre-Stonewall gay rights movement, where they say, we don't want to be affiliated in any way with the dirty rabble-rousers who are marching and causing trouble and smoking pot outside the White House. We want to be, in Frank's words, we want to be employed, so we damn well better look employable. And what I try to get at in the book is some of the unintended consequences of that, where he was essentially sacrificing individuality, but also inclusion. And I think that was something that he ended up having to cope with and fix and adapt, I think, a bit too late. But that is what was the big intervention of Stonewall.
Now, can you set up for people, what was the difference between sexology and the homophile movement?
Well, sexology was, as you said, a new field that was really contained more within academia. It was more a new study of human sexuality. And of course, one study that influenced not just Frank, but a large number of activists was the Kinsey Report, because it gave, despite his somewhat shaky methodology, it gave proof that there was a minority group that existed within America, a very large, vibrant one. Kameny used his own translations to make it, to claim that it was about 10% were homosexuals. So it gave them the numbers to say, wait a second, if we organize and convince these people who are engaging in this activity, in homosexual activity, who may not consider themselves to be part of a minority group, if we convince them, just like the Marxists convinced workers that they were part of an oppressed minority that they didn't recognize, then maybe we can actually wield political power. And so that's something that you see Harry Hay referencing the Kinsey Report, and you certainly see Frank Kameny referencing it. Now, the homophile movement was very much a movement of activism. Rather than just studying sexual activity, it was about promoting the rights of the sexual deviants. And I think there was a relationship between them. You see a lot of activists allying with researchers like Evelyn Hooker, like Sexology magazine, which was really an academic journal essentially, but with more of a popular audience, because they said, here's our numbers, here's our, as we're dealing with a regime that is telling us we're immoral and that we don't exist. You have the Civil Service Commission literally saying homosexual as a noun does not exist. Then, you can point to the numbers that say, actually, it does.
So what were the concrete demands of the homophile movement, and what were their strategies for achieving them?
Well, prior to Frank, you see this glimmer of radicalism, and then at what John D'Amelio calls a retreat to respectability. And I know there's been pushback to that recently, especially by those like Martin Meeker, but I think you see at the very beginning, for people who don't know, in 1950, in the context of McCarthyism, you see the very first organizing on at least a national level of the gays, of sexual deviants, and trying to achieve law reforms such as the legalization of sodomy, such as the end of the gay purges or the Lavender Scare. But because so many of them came from the Communist Party, literally, they were members and quite involved in it, or they were fellow travelers, the early activists initiated their own purges of the communists, of those who would threaten their own political progress. So after 53, really, you see that retreat to respectability, where it becomes more of a matter of, let's assimilate, let's prove to the world that we are good, moral, upstanding citizens. And that really is the case all the way up until Frank Kameny in 1961, when he and a few other allies like Randy Wicker, Lily Vincennes, Barbara Giddings, of course, who say, wait a second, the goal should not be just fitting in and convincing other people that we're good people. We need to be lobbying. We need to be picketing. We need to be demanding change. So it becomes much more militant. And for Frank, as someone who was a victim of the gay purges, he was kicked out of the government in his job, never allowed to work in the field of astronomy again, because all those jobs required a security clearance. His number one goal was really ending the gay purges, and really continued fighting all the way until the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, because that was really just a continuation of the exact same phenomenon. And so, of course, there were different priorities, especially lesbian groups who said, well, you know, we have our own unique problems that aren't as related to men getting caught in public restrooms and fighting for the end of sodomy laws or vagrancy laws or indecent conduct. And so you see in the book a lot of these conversations about what those priorities should be. And ultimately, I think you see that it needs to be intersectional. There needs to be a conversation about how do we prioritize the most marginalized members, not just those who actually manage to get a job, but those who are homeless or who don't have these federal jobs to begin with.
They're undocumented now.
Truly.
So I had asked you to prepare a section to read from your book, and since, you know, the gay movement from initially was a movement in struggle against the police, I think you have a section to share with us.
Yes.
That's relevant to that. Yes.
Absolutely, and I'm going to read from my Stonewall section just because I've been looking for a good opportunity to read from it, especially given the current history that we're living through. And Frank actually doesn't make an appearance here because he wasn't at Stonewall. So forgive me to anyone who is looking forward to a feature on Frank, but I think it shows some of the conflicts that we've been talking about. On the night of June 27th, Yvonne Ritter, wearing her mother's dress and surrounded by 200 other patrons, sat in the Stonewall Inn. The bar itself was grim. Black walls, a black ceiling, blacked out windows, and weak drinks. But it played the Supremes and the Rolling Stones. It had go-go dancers. It felt safe. As Ritter sat there, a group of 6 NYPD officers amassed outside. 2 female officers already sat inside the bar, posing as lesbians, watching. More than a year after Craig Rodwell had criticized the mafia's ownership of gay bars, the city was finally taking action. The last 3 weeks of June, it had conducted 5 raids against purported clubs like the Stonewall, de facto bars that sold liquor without a license. The raids occurred in the middle of a mayoral election campaign, when harassment of homosexuals historically spiked. Indeed, raids against gay bars looked good for those who conducted them. Officers in the city government could boost their arrest numbers. There were easy arrests too. The drag queens never fought back. Everybody behaved, the officer in charge of the raids later recalled. It was like, we're going down to grab the fags. At 1:20 a.m., the officers entered the Stonewall. The music turned off and the bright white lights turned on. Ritter, terrified, ran for the bathroom where she thought she could escape through a window. As she reached the door, an arm grabbed for her. "You're not going nowhere," said the officer. The police dragged her back to the bar and pushed her up against a wall, along with other patrons who defied gender norms. The officers demanded identification, and the police women began performing their second duty of the evening. They took the trans women to the bathroom, where the police women examined their genitalia. If patrons did not wear the 3 proper items of clothing, they were arrested. Usually, the threat of an examination was sufficient to scare the suspected transvestites, as the police called them, into confession. Usually, the officers led them to the bathroom and they admitted it. "All right, honey, I'm a man." But in the second raid of the Stonewall in a single week, and that night, the patrons in drag resisted the authorities. "Get your hands off me," they said. "Don't touch me." Female officers examined 5 trans patrons, but Ritter showed her identification. "Joseph," it said. The officers released the humiliated women and arrested Ritter. Officers told another group of detained patrons, identified by one witness as a lesbian woman, to stand against a black wall. Male officers pushed them, frisked them, and touched them. Meanwhile, the gay men in the bar stood in a single file line, and one by one, after showing identification, they exited. As they waited outside for their friends to emerge, they sometimes struck a pose, eliciting applause, and the crowd swelled in size. They called their friends from payphones. The atmosphere grew festive. The patrons arrested for improper dress then arrived. A police officer shoved one of them, and she hit him back with her purse. He hit her with his club. A village voice reporter heard boos and catcalls. Someone suggested they tip over the police wagon. An officer led Ritter to the police van full of patrons in female clothing. When the officer returned to retrieve another one, Ritter slipped out. The officer saw her and begged for her to stop. "Please, it's my birthday. I'm 18, she begged. Ritter was sobbing, her makeup running. The officer, surrounded by hundreds of increasingly angry patrons, looked the other way. Ritter ran for the anonymity of the crowd, now numbering 400, and the van drove away. Officers then brought another patron, whom they identified as a woman, wearing cropped hair, male clothes, and handcuffs. One witness noticed a black leather suit. Another described the apparel as, quote, fancy go-to bar drag for a butch dyke. She put up a struggle, reported the voice. A dyke, wrote one witness, lost her mind on the streets of the West Village, kicking, cursing, screaming, and fighting. Twice, this patron escaped from the police car before getting caught. After the second time, an officer grabbed and violently threw the patron into the car. A voice, a witness recalled it sounded female, shouted, "Why don't you guys do something?" It was at that moment, reported the voice, that the scene became explosive. Limp wrists were forgotten. Beer cans and bottles were heaved at the windows, and a rain of coins descended on the cops. With cries of police brutality, pigs, and faggot cops, the insurrection began. The officers retreated backward and bolted the door of the bar. The mob used an uprooted parking meter as a battering ram. The door swung open, and an officer was hit by a flying object. The police grabbed a man from the crowd, dragged him into the bar, and beat him mercilessly. A voice reporter was trapped inside the bar with the officers. "The sound filtering in doesn't suggest dancing faggots anymore," he later wrote. "It sounds like a powerful rage, bent on vendetta." The window shattered. The officers, certain that the mob would storm the bar, pointed their guns outside. "We'll shoot the first motherfucker who comes through the door," said one of them. Outside, calls of, "Let's get some gas." An arm poured lighter fluid into the room, then threw a match. A whoosh of flames. The officers prepared to shoot, and a massacre seemed imminent. Suddenly, the sound of sirens. Fire trucks arrived, followed by 2 buses of riot police. The officers escaped, and the reinforcements turned their hoses and clubs onto the crowds. For several hours, trans women, drag queens, and street youth, or hustlers who worked the piers in 42nd Street, fought and taunted the riot police. Facing the helmeted officers, the street youth sang, "We are the Stonewall Girls," chanting a chorus line, kicking their heels. Nightsticks swung at heads and backs. The rioters ran, but the officers ran faster. Witnesses saw young men, covered in blood, dragged into police cars. Craig Rodwell, the young veteran of Randy Wicker's first New York picket, yelled, "Gay power," while watching from a stoop. The next evening, Saturday, the crowds grew larger. They blocked the street, and flames rose from the trash cans. Rioters threw bottles, and windows broke. One black trans woman, Marsha P. Johnson, miraculously climbed a lamppost in high heels and a tight-fitting dress. She dropped a bag full of bricks onto a police car below, shattering its windshield. The riot police arrived again, and the street youths reprised their taunts and chorus lines. By 3:30 a.m., the crowds dispersed. On Sunday afternoon, a sign appeared on the Stonewall's window. "We homosexuals plead with our people to please help maintain peaceful and quiet conduct on the streets of the village." Signed, the Mattachine. The crowds, though smaller and less violent, still returned that night. Officers scattered them in a single sweep, but the Stonewall stayed open, playing rock and roll. The poet, Allen Ginsberg, a veteran of the MSNY's first picket, entered the Stonewall and danced there. "You know, the guys were so beautiful," he said upon leaving. "They've lost that wounded look that fags all had 10 years ago." That night, Yvonne Ritter stayed in Brooklyn. She had been avoiding the village, lying low after taking the subway home Saturday morning. As she graduated from high school that week, an image, a feeling, remained imprinted in her mind. After she escaped to the police van full of drag queens and blended into the angry crowd, makeup streaking down her face, she too picked something off the ground, maybe a brick or a piece of glass, she does not know, and threw it in anger, in defiance, and pride.
Great, thank you so much, Eric. So now let's open it up for questions.
Sure.
I have one thing. I've always questioned the concept of bricks at Stonewall,
Mm-hmm.
because where would those bricks come from?
Well, if current events are ever an indication, they just mysteriously appear and somehow are found with questionable origins. I don't know. I think the Marsha P. Johnson image of her climbing the lamppost, that was something that Craig Rodwell saw with his own eyes happen. And who knows if it was actually bricks inside the pillowcase or whatever the bag was that she was climbing up. But I think the larger question is, who cares? You know, who cares what was thrown, whether it was a shot glass or a brick? I think that actually minimizes the importance of the moment and what actually was occurring, and also the contributions of those like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, not just on those 4 nights, but before and after Stonewall. And as you know, a big part of the book that I'm honestly most proud of is some of the findings that I was able to find about Sylvia Rivera and her indispensable contributions to the Gay Activists Alliance in particular. And so when I think you see, especially in the popular media, this focus on, you know, who really threw the first shot glass or what really happened at the Stonewall, I think that's a red herring. I think we need to be asking larger questions of people's contributions around and especially after Stonewall.
Okay, well then let's go to questions.
Yeah, and I want to encourage anyone who hasn't asked a question, please just press the little ask a question button.
All right, I'm back, I think. So yeah, we have 3 questions so far, and I'm also peeking over here at my second laptop, my computer, at the Facebook live chat. So if you ask questions in the Facebook live chat, I'll be able to look at them as well. But the first question is a question about the international dimension in Khomeini's gay politics. I wonder whether there is an international context for his activism. Across the globe, there were upsurges in state-induced repression of gay men and other sexual minorities in the 50s and 60s, maybe an effect of a newly strong and powerful state in the wake of World War II.
Oh, absolutely. There definitely is international context, especially after Stonewall. Of course, he didn't just stop after Stonewall happened and after his own organization, the Mattachine Society of Washington, became essentially a one-man organization. He continued working as part of the ACLU, which was very much in conversation with especially British reformers, especially after their own successes with overturning sodomy laws before Stonewall. And so there is that conversation, and there is some really good studies. One I would recommend is by David Minto, who I believe is at Durham University in the UK, who actually talks about the transnational homophile movement and how some of these conversations were taking place. In the Carpenter Hall archives in London are a great resource also to see how US activists were actually, including Frank, were in conversation with the law reformers in the UK. And then, of course, even before Frank's time, German activists had a number of publications. We're talking in some of the very first homophile or gay publications that were ever disseminated in the US were actually German. They came, whether it was the Circle, Der Kreis, I think is how you say it. So a lot of great work done. If you just Google transatlantic homophile movement, Dr. Minto's work should come up, and it's really wonderful. But Sarah, I'm sure, especially in your research in ACT UP and the 80s, I'd be curious about what you found on kind of the transatlantic front later in Frank's life.
Oh, that would take me a month to tell you. So let's save that for another time.
Okay.
Okay. What else do you have there?
All right. So, and this is a question we can maybe open up to both of you. Given that millennials are part of a generation that is inclusive and queer youth can comfortably integrate with their peers, that today we hook up via apps rather than meeting in venues? How do we encourage younger queers to learn our history, value those who fought for the freedoms we have, and participate in community and advocacy?
Sarah, I would.
To you. I defer to you.
Only if you also give a follow-up, because I mean, you've been doing this for much longer than me, and I think galvanizing the kids is one thing that I'm still trying to figure out. But I think at least with this book, what I've tried to do, kind of my theory going into at least marketing it, is these were human beings, right? And I think you see it in any sort of popular depiction of history, whether it's in Hollywood or within the publishing world. As soon as you strip people of their feelings and their emotions and the sex and the drama and the conflict, then it doesn't become relatable. And I think I think historians actually have an obligation to include that, because so much of history is the result of these more dramatic elements that are really appealing to young kids and to just the general public. So, why was J. Edgar Hoover so obsessed with the Mattachine Society and the homophile activists? Well, it wasn't because on some political, policy-making level that he was just really interested in this problem. It was because he hated and was obsessed with them because they were making these claims about his own sexuality, and he wanted to nip that in the bud, so to speak. So, you have to be telling the more kind of illicit parts of history in order to tell all of the history. And so, I don't know. I think that's what I would encourage, other historians who have done the hard work and done all the research, is maybe make a version of what you're publishing that is kind of like the unfiltered, uncensored, unacademic lingo, whether it's in the New York Times or Vice, because kids should be knowing all of the history.
Well, when Jim Hubbard and I started the ACT UP Oral History Project in 2001, and I want to invite people to come to our website. It's actuporalhistory.org. We interviewed 188 surviving members of ACT UP over 18 years, and we've had 14 million hits on our site.
Wow.
But when we started that project, we started to ask ourselves, why is 20th century US history not have an AIDS component? It doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
In high school and also in intro US history. So we went to the American something of historians. I'm not an academic, and neither is Jim. I'm a professor, but I teach creative writing. And so we had this big presentation about you can integrate this material into your 20th century, and the only people who shut up were queer. So there was a real resistance. Then in 2012, we made a film called United in Anger, A History of ACT UP, which we've made available for free on YouTube and all of that. And we found that people were afraid to teach it because they were embarrassed by the material. So Matt Brim, if you know his book, Poor Queer Studies, which is really an incredible book that came out this year, he did a teaching guide to United in Anger that is now available online for free. So that teachers who want to teach it but feel that they don't know how to talk about anal sex or drugs or whatever, they can just follow the teaching guide. So we've done everything we can to make it as possible for people, but they have prejudices, in curriculum construction that keeps this information out. Yeah. Anyway. What's next on the list there?
Okay, so next is I too am a history major, but I ended up going to law school. Yay, history. My focus was on women's history. My question is this: you make a lot of parallels between the civil rights movement and the LGBTQ movement. The women's rights movement peaked in the early 70s, and Betty Friedan's Lavender Threat was a large part then. Do you think that LGBTQ movement borrowed anything from the women's movement at all that was helpful?
Oh my gosh, so much of it.
Lesbians were. Oh, we have two different answers.
Oh, you said no. Okay, you go first.
Do I think that gay women, when we started the Lesbian Avengers in 1992, our initial club card that we made out and handed out to people said, lesbians, dykes, gay women. Because those were three different groups of people who identified with different terms. And the gay women who were in what we're now called the LGBT movement, but at that time was called the gay movement, were often very alienated from the feminist movement. And the feminist movement notoriously had lesbian purges. In fact, I experienced a lesbian purge in the reproductive rights movement in an organization called Carassa in 1982, although it wasn't called that. So there's always been a lot of tension. And, ultimately, I think one of the failures of traditional feminism or straight feminism is that heterosexual men never really got involved. So heterosexual men never really got involved in the abortion rights movement. And one of the advantages of the queer movement is that queer people need each other for love and sex. So they're always going to have to try to find each other. But if you construct a movement where you're asking heterosexual women to basically put themselves in a situation where love and sex are not available, it's very hard to create that kind of counterculture to sustain it. So those divisions and those antagonisms, and they play out even in the Roe v. Wade case itself. They ultimately hurt the feminist movement. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's heartbreaking also, especially with the people who I interviewed, who were lesbians who were also dedicated to women's liberation, feeling as if they had to make a choice between the homophile movement and women's liberation. So people like Del Martin eventually said, "I give up. This homophile movement is completely dominated by men, and so I'm going to put my emphasis on women's liberation." But then, just as Sarah said, then there's within women's liberation its own purges who were pushing out the Lavender Menace. And so what you end up happening is a lot of these organizations that are for lesbians, and whether it's Radical Lesbians, Lavender Menace themselves. But I think also to answer your question, yes, the homophile movement did borrow from, or even really the gay liberation movement borrowed from women's liberation. So when you had, especially I think you see it in the theatricality of protests, so especially in the zaps of like the Gay Activists Alliance and other organizations. So you had women burning their bras at the Miss America pageant because that was a very powerful visual demonstration. And you see very similar things with a focus. You see it, of course, with ACT UP, of the focus on creating this visual spectacle in order to make a political point. And I think that was borrowed from women's liberation, and the real shame of it all is that there, if anyone's seen Mrs. America, right, like Betty Friedan was really not the best friend to lesbians, like really was not antagonistic. And then you have the Lavender Menace utilizing those same exact tactics of spectacle, right, when they were wearing the Lavender Menace shirts and took over a feminist convention in 1970. So it's very interesting that, yes, they did borrow from the women's liberation movement, but then they used those same tactics against it when they were being excluded from it. So it's a complicated...
Well, I want to shout out to two really important historians of the early lesbian movement. One is Marcia Gallo, who wrote that incredible history of Daughters of Bilitis that is underread and really should be in those classes that we're talking about. And the second is Nan Alamia Boyd, who did a history of gay San Francisco with a very important interview with Phyllis Lyons. So that work, it was done, it just never got the play that it really deserved. I wanted to say something about Craig Rodwell, who I knew, of course.
Oh, really?
And, when he opened, I just want to say, I don't think he's totally reliable as a source, just to say that. But anyway, okay, but when he opened the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookstore on Christopher Street, I went there when I was in high school. And this was before the gay and lesbian book boom. And you were mentioning radical lesbians before. The men's books would be books like Cycle Suck and stuff like that, like porn books, basically, novels, erotic novels. And the women's shelf would be these Xeroxed or dittoed, I guess, before Xerox, leaflets by groups like the Radical Lesbians that were stapled that you could buy, because lesbian literature, there was very little of it available. Anyway, he died, because he was a Christian Scientist. And so when he had stomach cancer, he didn't treat it. Yeah, right. Craig. But I remember him very well. Anything else on the list there? Yeah,
we've got, I think, two more questions I think we can get to, or three more. Or is it two more? The next question is, your comments on respectability and assimilation evoked current trends of transphobia within the LGB portion of the community, and even discrimination against gender nonconforming people among the binary trans community. Could you speak about this impulse to throw others under the proverbial bus in order to gain social credibility throughout the history of queer activism up to the present?
It's everywhere, right? I mean, it is just the one, I think probably one of the most heartbreaking parts of all of studying this social movement is this fallacy that there is a way to make sexual deviants or queers more palatable, to make the rights of some of them more palatable to the majority or to the oppressor by, as you said, throwing the most marginalized members of the community under the bus. And the book, The Deviant's War, talks about one of the first instances where I found that happening first with Frank and his dress code, which I think was really unfortunate and exclusionary, even though maybe it was unintentional, but then you have the much more explicit, intentional instances of it occurring where Sylvia Rivera, because of her, the Gay Activists Alliance becomes an incorporated organization in the state of New York, because she is the first one to get arrested for their city council petition in 1970. She finds the attorney that then becomes the GAA's attorney and legitimizes the entire organization. That organization and its legal action committee then becomes Lambda Legal, which 20 years later becomes the first to join the marriage fight in Hawaii in 93. And so what happened, though, you have to tell the story of what happened next, which is when she organized her own pickets against NYU later in 1970, the executive meeting minutes of the Gay Activists Alliance says explicitly, we will not join these pickets because they were organized by, quote, street people, right? So who cared about the merits of the protest itself? Because it had this image of being organized by the most marginalized, they wouldn't join it. They then removed trans protections from that very city council bill that she got arrested fighting for. What happened? The bill still failed. 20 years later, 30 years later, when the Human Rights Campaign removed trans protections from its federal anti-discrimination legislation, what happened? It still failed. George W. Bush still threatened to veto it. So time and time again, you see that it's self-defeating. It ends up doing much more harm than good. And you actually see that it's the instances when activists are the most inclusive and put its most marginalized members up top, leading the decisions, leading the protests. That is when real change is made. And the biggest proof is Stonewall. That's why I read it, because for once, who was leading the charge at Stonewall, regardless of kind of the shaky eyewitnesses, it was without a doubt the homeless, trans kids and sex workers who were leading the fight. And for once, everyone in the entire movement, or who weren't in the movement, who said, I don't want to be a part of that suit wearing, professional queens. What did they call Miss Madish? They called Randy Wicker Miss Madishine in all the gay bars in New York, because he would show up wearing his, preppy attire and try to convince them to join. And I said, no way, why would I join that? It's not for me. And then after Stonewall, that's when everyone realizes, hey, this is much bigger than just Frank Kameny and Randy Wicker marching around in suits.
Great, thank you.
And then there's a question for Sarah. As a native New Yorker who was pretty young at the time of Stonewall, what are your memories of those events? Were they on your radar?
I was born in 1958, so I was a child at Stonewall. But I do, I was born on East 10th Street, though, so quite close to there. And I do remember as a child, there was an incident where there was two things. An Argentinian, I think, gay man was arrested at a bar and was brought into a police station that was 2 blocks from my house. And he jumped out the window and was impaled on the gate.
The snake pit.
Yeah, and I remember that happening. And then there was a famous bakery called Sutter's, where my father used to go to buy rolls, and it was across the street from the Women's House of Detention. And so, this is before gentrification, so there was a huge women's prison right in the middle of the village. And when we would go to buy these rolls, women would be screaming out the window of the prison, and people would be standing on the street yelling up at them. And I never knew really what it was. It was just part of my childhood landscape. Later, when I read Joan Nessel's work, I found out that it was sex workers and women who'd been arrested in lesbian bar raids on the previous Saturday night.
Oh,
Who
wow.
were yelling up and down to their pimps or to their girlfriends or whatever out the window. And that's the prison where Valerie Solarnis was, where Angela Davis was. I mean, it was, and when they gentrified the village, they had to get rid of it, right? So they moved it to Bedford Hills.
Wow. A fun fact about that. Sorry, a fun fact about that raid. The snake pit raid.
Let me just say that Hugh Ryan is writing a history of the Women's House of Detention that I'm sure will be amazing.
Ooh, he's wonderful. And that raid you mentioned where I think his name was Diego Canales or something like that. Yeah, where he got impaled because of that raid. That is what first initiated the Gay Activist Alliance's legal committee. And they were going to sue the NYPD because of that raid and because of all these men taken without attorneys and held at the police station. And they formed the very first iteration of the legal committee of the Gay Activist Alliance in response to that raid. But they couldn't find any attorneys to actually join and file the lawsuit and kind of take charge. So it became defunct. They basically retired it. And the only thing that caused the Legal Action Committee, they renamed it, to come back into being was Sylvia Rivera getting arrested in April 1970, a month after that raid. And then that's when she found really the first attorney who was willing to represent, and I believe he was straight, to represent the Gay Activist Alliance. And then finally, the Gay Activist Alliance has a legal committee. So it's so interesting how, police oppression and, the most marginalized, again, kind of taking up arms for the more privileged part of a community.
No, thank you. That's great.
And I guess we'll maybe end with I'll ask the standard bookseller question, which is what you are both reading right now. Oh, it looks like I froze. Maybe I froze.
Okay. Well, I'm reading a book called The Empire of Critique by Saed Atshan, which is a history of the Palestinian queer movement. And it's quite a fascinating book. It's an intense book, and I recommend that. That's from Stanford University Press. And also a book I mentioned earlier, Matt Brim's Poor Queer Studies from Duke. It's a fantastic book. It's about facing elitism in the university and the role of queer studies in that structure.
Thank you, Sarah. It looks like we might have lost Eric. I might give him a second to see if he can reconnect. It looks like he was maybe experiencing some internet issues. And so we'll see if he comes back on, although my crowdcast acumen.
What are you reading?
I'm reading, well, I have been in a long struggle with Frank Herbert's Dune for most of quarantine, which I wanted to revisit for a variety of truly selfish, escapist reasons. But I, in light of everything that's going on, have sort of been, like many people, revisiting and reassembling some reading lists that fell by the wayside. So I'm hoping to, I've been reading a lot of Kiyanka Yamada Taylor's stuff in the New Yorker recently. And it's reminding me that I have a couple of her books here behind me on a bookshelf. And so I'm been meaning to pick those up as well. I feel like I have an attention span to just read like really short things these days. I don't know if that's common, but that's sort of what's happening to me right now. Yeah, as a bookseller, I've become prone to sort of derelicting my duty as someone who's supposed to recommend books to people. Oh, I think Eric's coming back.
I'm back. Sorry about that.
That's great.
I warned y'all about Crowdcast. Anyone who's watching, don't ever use Crowdcast for your book tour.
So what are you reading, Eric?
Yeah, what are you reading, Eric?
I'm reading the Pink Line by Mark Gavesser. That comes out. It's another FSG author. It comes out in I think next month. And someone asked about transnational activism. He kind of travels the world and looks at different battles for LGBTQ plus equality across the entire world, ranging from Africa to the Middle East, everywhere. So highly recommend it. I think it comes out late July.
Great.
Actually,
you probably pre-ordered that.
He was an important figure because Mark was in ACT UP New York. You know, he was a South African who was in exile during the apartheid era.
I had no idea.
And when he returned to South Africa, he brought quite a few, he was a communicator between those two movements.
Wow.
So he's quite, somebody needs to write about him. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. We're doing like a joint podcast episode with Jackson, our editor, tomorrow, I believe. So I'm going to make sure to ask him about that.
Oh, great.
Well, yeah, that brings us to the hour. Thank you, Sarah Shulman. Thank you, Eric Servini. You can buy the Deviants War. If you're watching at Crowdcast, there's a buy button right there. If you're watching on Facebook Live, you can head to literatibookstore.com to buy the Deviants War. Thank you so much, both of you, for taking the time to talk about this book today. To join us all here in Ann Arbor, so people tuning in from all over the world, Australia, coast to coast. So we appreciate it. And thanks again.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Sarah.
I really enjoyed your book.